London, 1814. A city defined by the soot of the early Industrial Revolution, the clatter of iron-rimmed wheels on cobblestones, and an insatiable thirst for porter. In the heart of the street, Giles District, a neighborhood known more for its desperate poverty than its grand architecture, stood the Horseshoe Brewery. Owned by Henry Moo and Company, it was a titan of industry, a sprawling complex where the smell of fermenting malt hung heavy in the damp air. To the residents of the surrounding rookery, a maze of overcrowded tenements and narrow alleys, the brewery was a constant, looming presence. They lived in its shadow, unaware that the very structures providing them with work and drink were under a physical strain that the engineering of the era could barely comprehend. On the afternoon of October 17th, the air was cooling as evening approached. Inside the brewery, the scale of production was staggering. The centerpiece of the operation was a series of massive wooden vats, held together by enormous iron hoops. One of these vessels, a towering structure 22 feet high, contained several thousand barrels of aging porter. It was a masterpiece of Georgian engineering, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface of the dark, fermenting liquid, a catastrophic failure was already in motion. At approximately 5:30 p.m., a 700-pound iron hoop snapped. This wasn't the first time such a thing had happened. In the history of the Mo Brewery, hoops had slipped before without incident. But this time, the physics of the situation were different. The remaining hoops could not shoulder the burden. The vat didn't just leak, it disintegrated. The sudden release of over 1 million pints of beer created a physical force that the brick walls of the brewery were never designed to withstand. The internal pressure caused a secondary collapse, triggering the failure of neighboring vats. In an instant, a wall of dark liquid, nearly 15 feet high, burst through the brewery's heavy brickwork and surged into the streets of Street Giles. It was a wave of industrial waste and alcohol, traveling with enough velocity to knock buildings off their foundations. But as the roar of the collapsing walls faded, a much deeper, more haunting silence took its place. What the residents found in the wake of the wave was not just property damage, but a scene of absolute devastation. And yet, as historians would later discover, the most perplexing part of this tragedy wasn't the flood itself, but the legal and social silence that followed. To understand why this happened, we have to look closer at the Horseshoe Brewery itself. It sat at the corner of Great Russell Street and Tottenham Court Road, a location that bridged the gap between London's commercial ambition and its most marginalised citizens. The Street Giles Rookery was a place of extreme density, where entire families occupied single basement rooms. The brewery was a symbol of the new age, massive, efficient, and profitable. The vats were the pride of the company, often shown off to visitors as marvels of modern capacity. Some of these vessels were so large they were used to host dinners for 20 people inside the empty hulls before they were filled. But this pursuit of scale came with a hidden cost. Records suggest that the wood used in these vats was subject to constant expansion and contraction, and the iron hoops, while massive, were prone to internal flaws that 19th century metallurgy could not detect. On that October afternoon, a brewery worker named George Magrath noticed the hoop had slipped. He later testified that he wasn't particularly alarmed. It was a common occurrence, and he was told a repair could wait. He had no way of knowing that within an hour, the structural integrity of the entire facility would vanish. The wave hit the New Street houses first. These were fragile structures, many of them subdivided into small, dark apartments. Because it was late afternoon, many families were gathered for tea or preparing for the evening. In one basement on New Street, a group of people had gathered for a wake. They were mourning a 2-year-old boy who had died the previous day. The flood offered no warning. The heavy doors were burst open, and the rooms were filled to the ceiling in seconds. The tragedy of the wake within a wake would become one of the most enduring and grim details of the event. But as the water, or rather, the beer settled into the gutters and the debris stopped moving, the true scale of the loss began to emerge. 8 people were dead, most of them women and children. The names are etched into the parish records: Eleanor Cooper, Mary Mulvey, Thomas Murphy, Hannah Banfield. Their deaths were violent and sudden, caused by drowning, internal injuries, or the collapse of the buildings they called home. Yet, as the city began to process the shock, the narrative began to shift. The focus moved from the victims to the brewery, and more importantly, to the question of who was to blame. Early reports from the scene were chaotic. Witnesses described the smell as overwhelming, a thick, sickly sweet odor of stale porter that lingered for weeks. There were stories, perhaps apocryphal, of locals rushing to the scene with buckets and pots to scoop up the spilled beer, leading to further illness and even death. Some historians believe these stories were exaggerated by the press of the time to paint the residents of Street Giles as opportunistic and drunken, shifting the moral weight of the tragedy away from the corporate giants and onto the poor. It is a pattern seen throughout Victorian history, the transformation of a corporate failure into a failing of the lower classes. The legal proceedings that followed were swift. A coroner's jury was convened at the Street Giles workhouse. They listened to the testimony of George Magrath and the brewery owners. They looked at the ruins of the vats and the splintered remains of the New Street tenements. The public expected a reckoning. They expected a deep dive into the safety protocols of an industry that was rapidly outgrowing its own infrastructure. What they got instead was a verdict that remains a point of intense debate among legal historians to this day. The jury returned a verdict of act of God. In the legal language of the time, this meant that the disaster was an unavoidable accident, a freak occurrence for which no human or corporation could be held responsible. This ruling was a massive victory for Moe and Company. It shielded them from having to pay compensation to the victims' families, many of whom had lost not only their loved ones but every stitch of clothing and furniture they owned. But the Act of God verdict was only the beginning of the mystery. It didn't explain why the brewery, despite its supposed innocence, was granted a massive tax rebate by the British Parliament shortly after the event. Records from the period show that the brewery petitioned the government for a refund on the excise duty they had already paid on the lost beer. In an unprecedented move, the government agreed, returning thousands of pounds to the company. This was money that could have rebuilt the lives of the survivors in Street Giles, yet it went back into the coffers of the brewery. To the modern eye, this looks like a clear case of corporate protectionism. But some historians suggest there was more to the story, that the government feared a ripple effect. If Moe and Company went bankrupt, it could destabilize the entire London brewing industry, an industry that provided a significant portion of the nation's tax revenue. The silence that followed the trial is what haunts the archives. While the flood itself was a sensation for a few weeks, it quickly faded from the front pages. There were no grand monuments erected to the 8 victims. No significant changes to brewery safety laws were enacted for years. The Horseshoe Brewery eventually rebuilt, its vats replaced with even larger, perhaps more secure versions. But the Act of God ruling created a legal vacuum. It left a question that still lingers. Was the jury truly convinced of the brewery's innocence, or were they pressured by forces that felt the economic health of the city was more important than the lives of a few residents in a London slum? What they found next in the surviving documents only added layers to the confusion. There are mentions of a private settlement, a series of payments made under the table to certain influential figures in the neighborhood. These were never officially recorded, and their existence remains a matter of speculation. If these payments were made, it suggests the brewery knew the Act of God verdict was a fragile shield. They were buying a silence that history has, until recently, largely respected. The immediate aftermath of the collapse was a scene of visceral horror that the dry language of official reports fails to capture. As the tidal wave of porter receded, it left behind a thick, dark silt of beer, mud, and the pulverized remains of human lives. The smell was the first thing survivors mentioned, a cloying, fermented sweetness that masked the more pungent scents of the London sewers that had been breached by the force of the flood. In the hours following the rupture, the Street Giles rookery became a site of frantic, desperate digging. Because many of the homes were basement dwellings, the beer had pooled in these low-lying areas, turning them into lethal traps. One of the most harrowing stories to emerge from the wreckage was that of the Saville family. They had gathered in a cellar on New Street to mourn a young child. The flood didn't just inundate their home, it effectively sealed it. When rescuers finally reached the basement, they found 5 bodies. The mourners had become the mourned. Yet, even in these accounts, there is a strange discrepancy in the historical record. Some contemporary newspapers reported that several people were rescued from the suffocating fumes of the beer, while others suggested that the weight of the liquid had caused the ceilings to collapse instantly. What truly happened in those final seconds remains unclear, as the survivors' voices were largely filtered through the sensationalist press of the era. But as the rescue efforts turned into a recovery operation, a different kind of story began to circulate, one that would color the public's perception of the disaster for the next 2 centuries. Rumors spread that the residents of Street Giles, rather than helping their neighbors, had rushed into the streets with every vessel they could find to drink the spilled porter. Some accounts even claimed that people died days later from alcohol poisoning after gorging themselves on the free beer. However, modern analysis of these claims suggests a much more cynical reality. There is no mention of such widespread looting in the official coroner's inquest, or in the hospital records of the time. Some historians believe these stories were manufactured or wildly exaggerated by the London middle class, who viewed the Irish immigrant population of street Giles with deep suspicion and prejudice. By framing the victims as drunken opportunists, the narrative shifted. It was no longer a story of industrial negligence. It was a story of a low-class neighborhood's chaotic nature. But that wasn't the strangest part of the story's evolution. While the public was distracted by tales of street-side revelry, the Horseshoe Brewery was facing an existential crisis. The loss of the beer and the damage to the facility was valued at over £20,000, an astronomical sum in 1814. Henry Moe and his partners were staring down the barrel of bankruptcy. The survival of the company depended entirely on the outcome of the legal proceedings. If the brewery were found negligent, the civil lawsuits from the families of the 8 victims would have finished them. And that's when the legal machinery of London began to move in a very specific direction. The coroner, a man named Mr. Gell, oversaw the inquest. The proceedings were held in a local pub, the Ship and Shovel, within sight of the brewery's ruins. The jury was composed of local men, but the influence of the bureaucracy, the powerful consortium of London brewers, loomed large. During the 19th century, porter was more than just a drink. It was a pillar of the British economy. The tax on beer funded the Napoleonic Wars. To hold a major brewery accountable for a structural failure was to admit that the entire industry was built on a foundation of unregulated risk. Records suggest that the defense focused heavily on the unforeseeable nature of the accident. They argued that the vat was a masterpiece of the era and that its failure was a catastrophic anomaly that no engineer could have predicted. They ignored the fact that the iron hoop had snapped nearly an hour before the collapse and that no one had thought to evacuate the surrounding buildings. When the jury delivered the Act of God verdict, it wasn't just a legal clearance. It was a signal that the industrial progress of London was not to be hampered by the safety of its poorest citizens. But what they found next in the brewery's ledgers suggests the Act of God was only the first half of the strategy. Within weeks of the disaster, Henry Moe and company petitioned the Commissioners of Excise. They argued that because the beer was lost before it could be sold, they should not have to pay the tax on it. In a move that shocked even contemporary observers, the government not only agreed, but granted a rebate on the duty already paid. The brewery received a refund of roughly £7,000. To put this in perspective, the families of the victims received nothing. There is no record of a single pound being paid by the brewery to the Saville family or the others who lost their homes. This financial maneuver remains one of the most controversial aspects of the 1814 beer flood. It suggests a level of collusion between the state and the industrial elite that goes beyond simple negligence. Some historians believe the tax rebate was a quiet bailout, designed to prevent a major taxpayer from failing during a time of national economic strain. Yet, despite this massive influx of cash and the legal clearance, something within the brewery's internal records doesn't add up. The technical reports regarding the failure of the vat seem to have vanished. In the years following the flood, the Horseshoe Brewery continued to operate, eventually becoming one of the most successful breweries in London. But the physical evidence of what went wrong on October 17th, the metallurgical analysis of the hoops, the architectural plans for the vat's foundation, were never made public. We are left with only the testimony of George McGrath, the man who saw the hoop break and did nothing. His account remains the primary source for the technical failure, but his loyalty to his employers makes his testimony inherently suspect. Was the Act of God verdict based on a genuine belief in a freak accident, or was it the result of missing evidence that would have proven Moe knew the vats were overstressed? The tension between these two possibilities is where the mystery of the 1814 beer flood truly lies. As the 19th century progressed, the event was treated less like a tragedy and more like a bizarre urban legend, a strange but true footnote in the history of London. But for the families who were displaced, the tragedy was anything but a footnote. The Rookery of Street. Giles was eventually cleared away in the mid-1800s to make room for New Oxford Street, a project often described as slum clearance. With the demolition of the tenements, the last physical traces of the flood were erased. The brewery itself was eventually demolished in 1922, and the Dominion Theatre now stands on the site. But what lay beneath the soil during that demolition was more than just old brickwork. What they found next changed the narrative entirely for those who began to dig into the cold cases of Victorian London. Archaeologists and researchers looking into the site's history discovered that the Horseshoe Brewery had a history of structural issues long before 1814. There are scattered mentions in local archives of leaks and tremors coming from the brewery walls in the years leading up to the disaster. If these records are accurate, it means the catastrophe wasn't a sudden, unexpected act of God, but the predictable endpoint of years of neglect. The mystery of the court ruling begins to look less like a historical puzzle and more like a deliberate act of erasure. But why was the erasure so successful? And how did the story of the looting become so entrenched in our collective memory that it overshadowed the deaths of 8 people? To find the answer, we have to look at the way the Victorian era began to categorize its citizens. The 1814 beer flood happened at a turning point in history, where the value of a human life was increasingly measured by its contribution to the industrial machine. The transition from the chaos of 1814 to the rigid Victorian order of the mid-19th century provided a convenient shroud for the beer flood. As London transformed into the gleaming capital of a global empire, the street Giles Rookery was increasingly seen as a relic of a shameful past. When the neighborhood was finally razed to make way for the expansion of the city's thoroughfares, the physical evidence of the flood was buried under layers of new stone and asphalt. But the psychological impact of the act of God ruling lived on, serving as a silent precedent for how the British legal system would handle industrial accidents for decades to come. If 1 million pints of beer could burst into a slum and kill 8 people without a single person being held liable, what did that say about the future of steam power, the railways, and the massive factories that were beginning to dominate the landscape? In the years following the disaster, the Horseshoe Brewery didn't just survive, it thrived. Henry Moe was eventually made a baronet, and his family became one of the wealthiest in England. The brewery's output continued to grow, fueled by the very same expansion of industrial capacity that had caused the 1814 failure. To the outside world, the flood was a closed chapter, a freak accident, a tragedy of the past. But for those who study the evolution of corporate law, the mystery remains. Why was there no pushback? Why did the families of Hannah Banfield and the Savilles never find a lawyer willing to challenge the act of God verdict? Some historians believe the answer lies in the specific social composition of the jury. While they were local men, they were often tradesmen whose own livelihoods were intertwined with the brewery's supply chain. In a neighborhood where the brewery was the primary employer and the primary consumer of local services, a verdict of negligence might have been a death sentence for the local economy. What they found next in the surviving fragments of local journals suggests a quiet, unspoken agreement among the community. To move on was to survive. However, as we move into the modern era, new evidence has begun to emerge that challenges the accidental nature of the flood. In the late 20th century, researchers began to re-examine the technical limitations of 19th century wood and iron construction. They found that the Horseshoe Brewery's vats were pushing the absolute physical limits of what those materials could handle. The internal pressure of several hundred tons of liquid against wooden staves held by iron hoops was a ticking time bomb. The mystery of the court ruling isn't that they didn't know this, it's that they likely did know and chose to ignore it in favor of industrial progress. Yet, there is one piece of the puzzle that continues to baffle researchers: the disappearance of the brewery's internal board minutes from that specific year. While the company's history is well documented, the private discussions regarding the 1814 maintenance schedule and the internal reaction to the hoop snapping remain conspicuously absent. What they would have revealed about the brewery's knowledge of the vat's condition is the missing key to the entire event. Without these records, we are left with a narrative that is 70% established fact and 30% shadow. But that wasn't the final twist in the story. In the modern day, the site of the Horseshoe Brewery is occupied by the Dominion Theatre on Tottenham Court Road. Millions of people have walked over the very ground where the wave of porter claimed its victims, usually without a single thought for the disaster. In recent years, a small plaque was finally installed nearby, but it does little to convey the scale of the horror or the complexity of the legal vacuum that followed. The free beer myth, however, remains the dominant way the story is told. It is a persistent, colorful lie that serves to mask a much darker truth about the value of human life in the face of corporate profit. Recent investigations by historians like Martin Cornell have done much to debunk the stories of the drunken mobs at the scene. By cross-referencing hospital records and burial logs, they have shown that the victims died of trauma and drowning, not of intoxication. The narrative of the looting poor was a convenient fiction, one that allowed the 19th century public to feel a sense of moral superiority over the victims. But why has this version of the story persisted for over 200 years? Some believe it is because the truth that a major corporation was protected by the state at the expense of its citizens is a much more uncomfortable story to tell. It's a story that hasn't changed as much as we might like to think. What happened next in the evolution of industrial safety was a slow, agonizingly late realization that the act of God was often just a cover for human negligence. The 1814 beer flood remains a haunting anomaly. It was a disaster that was both absurd and terrifying, a moment where the mundane reality of a pint of beer became a lethal force of nature. But the true tragedy wasn't just the flood itself, it was the silence that followed. The court ruling that declared the deaths an act of God effectively erased the victims from history, turning their lives into a legal footnote. And that's when the narrative finally comes full circle. Today, as we look back at the Horseshoe Brewery through the lens of archival photographs and reconstructed maps, we are forced to ask, if the same disaster happened today, would the outcome be any different? We like to believe our modern regulations and legal systems would provide a different answer, yet the patterns of corporate protection and the marginalization of the vulnerable remain strikingly familiar. The final court ruling of 1814 remains a mystery, not because the facts were lost, but because the truth was never intended to be found. The records suggest a failure of engineering, but the silence suggests a failure of justice. In the end, the beer flood wasn't just an accident of wood and iron. It was a reflection of a society that was learning, for the first time, how to prioritize the machine over the man. As the sun sets over the Dominion Theatre today, the shadows of the old brewery walls seem to lengthen. The street is busy, loud, and modern. But beneath the pavement, the remnants of the street, Giles' rookery, still rest. The 8 victims, Eleanor Cooper, Mary Mulvey, and the others remain silent, their stories told in fragments, their deaths still attributed to a divine act rather than human error. What remains unclear is whether we will ever truly reconcile the strange history of the beer flood with the cold reality of the lives it took. Or perhaps, like the Londoners of 1814, we prefer the legend because it is easier to swallow than the truth. The mystery doesn't lie in what happened at 5:30 p.m. on October 17th. The mystery lies in what happened in the courtroom afterward, and why we are still talking about the beer, but not the blood.